Hello everyone, this is Honey Badger aka Triode Region here, and I just want to talk a little bit today about a concept that is very near and dear to my heart, which is efficient line of sight walling in Foundry VTT using first order visibility techniques, theory, and application. An overly verbose title for slapping down walls and making sure the line of sight works. Now, I think we're all probably familiar with a very common type of walling, which is what I refer to as trace walling. Whenever you see a wall on the map, you draw a line of sight blocker right on top of it, and you continue that throughout the map. And what you end up with at the end is effectively an outline trace of the entire map, all of the walls, all of the nooks, all of the crannies. That is what I refer to as trace walling. And if we were to classify different walling techniques based on three categories, accuracy, performance, and aesthetics, then I would classify trace walling as highly accurate and highly aesthetically pleasing, which is to say the walls are smooth and there aren't large breaks in your line of sight. Now, one thing that trace walling does not accomplish very well is performance. And in most virtual tabletops, I would probably say all, but particularly in Foundry VTT, the performance of your light calculations and your dynamic vision displays and updates and walking around the map revealing fog of war are heavily dependent upon the number of walls you have multiplied by the number of light sources you have. So for trace walling, we're effectively making the maximum number of walls possible because we are tracing every single drawn wall. Now today I want to introduce a slightly different walling technique, what I refer to as silhouette walling. We'll get into exactly what that looks like in a second, but as a brief overview, it trades aesthetics for performance while also maintaining a high degree of accuracy. It is not perfect, but I would estimate about 95% of the line of sight will be identical to trace walling. The big thing that this misses is the aesthetics, which is to say, you will see large empty gaps of your map. Now, those gaps are going to naturally be in non-traversable areas, and if you were playing, in real life on a table in front of you with maps and miniatures, seeing the whole terrain is kind of a given, and you can't put your piece inside of a wall, for example. And this is really what silhouette walling is trying to accomplish. It's trying to give that freedom of more of an open view of the map while still making sure that when you're peeking around corners, you are half hidden. So, before I get into examples, I really want to talk about just a little bit of the theory that goes into this. And this is a very complex and deep subject, but the concept of visibility and silhouette edges is something that I personally find absolutely fascinating. And I've kind of shown or attempted to draw a simple example here. If you can imagine just a cube just sitting in the world and you are standing some distance from it, if you were to think about the silhouette of that cube, and a silhouette is simply the outermost edges of an object. If you've ever seen a portrait of somebody in silhouette, you know that's a black center with just the outside, the outer tracing of their nose and their mouth is visible. And this is kind of what I've attempted to show on this right-hand side. If we were to look at this cube and think about this cube's silhouettes, these red and black lines on the outside are really the only thing that matters as far as what is hidden or visible behind this object. So I've drawn these black and red lines, and those are important because what we're going to be trying to do is translate this idea of a 3D object down into flat world, or a two-dimensional world that our miniatures live in a virtual tabletop. So if you can imagine being Randall here with no vision, being Randall and looking at this large boxy structure in front of you and only being able to look left and right and not being able to look up and down as we do all the time, then this lower cutout is an approximation of what Randall would be seeing. The left edge of this cube here lines up with this left cube here. The center edge here, 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 and here. Now, if you were to take the silhouette of this flat world cube, the only edges that would matter for hiding things behind this 2D cube are the outermost edges, here and here. Notice the center edge makes no difference whatsoever in what we can see. It would not hide or obscure anything, and so we don't care about it. This will make a little bit more sense when we see examples on the next page, but this is the basic concept. It's the idea of when you look at an object, what are the actual edges or elements of that object that matter when we're trying to figure out if you can see something behind it. So I'll be referring to these probably by habit as FOSSEs, which stands for first order silhouette edges. First order just means the simplest, most basic case. Silhouette and silhouette edge means the, well, silhouette edges, as I'm tracing here. So I might slip up and call them FOSSEs as I'm used to calling them, but they are generally just silhouettes. So now I want to move on to some examples, kind of showing this idea in practice. So this first example, just a purely convex object, which is effectively what we saw on the last screen, just two cubes side by side. The left-hand cube, I have walled it using a traditional method of just trace walling. Wherever there's a wall, I drew a line of sight blocker. Now, on the right-hand side, this is an example of using the concept of these silhouette edges to decide where we actually need walls in order to block line of sight. Before I get into too much about how I decide to place these vertices, just kind of want to show you an example of the fact that they provide the exact same effective visibility using two fundamentally different walling techniques. So if Randall is sitting right here in the corridor, he can see the goblin just fine. As he takes a step towards the trace walled object, you can see that as soon as you step behind this first corner, the goblin disappears. And you can see his line of sight extending about a 45-degree angle across the grid. As we continue to step further behind the object, we see that our line of sight gets more and more restricted. If we were to pull back from the object, all of a sudden we can start seeing down this corridor again. And if I get to about here, then Randall can see part of the goblin. In this case, I would give the goblin half cover, but that's beside the point. So now let's look over at our silhouette walled object. We're going to do the exact same experiment. We're going to step behind the silhouette wall, and we'll notice that at the exact same place, the goblin disappears. And in fact, we have the exact same line of sight visibility line as I continue to step further behind this object. And if I come back out, step away from the object, we can see that I get the exact same reveal of this goblin, which is about half of the token. So hopefully that small example is enough to convince you that we can approximate the same line of sight with far fewer walls. So to dive into this, it's a very simple example, but 4 walls versus only 2. Now the question is, where do we place these walls and why? And there are simply 2 concerns: the silhouettes and what I call the null terrain. If we flip back to this original page, we can try and apply this idea. If this is a cube And we've already identified these two edges as the only important bits for visibility. Let's see if we can translate this back to our top-down cube view. If Randall was sitting diagonal to the object, as we did in the first slide, we would note that this edge and this edge would be silhouettes. And as far as silhouette walling is concerned, if you can find a silhouette, you need a wall vertex. So we place a wall vertex here, and we have a convenient second vertex to place as well. And we just pull it all the way across the object. I'll get into why I do this crossing in just a second. So if we just had that one, that would be a pretty good estimation. Let me remove this to show. If we're viewing the object from this side, we can see that the line of sight works as expected. If we were to step to the other side of the fully walled, trace-walled object, we see that the line of sight is pretty much the same. Now, unfortunately, if we start stepping around this, we can see the goblin straight through the object. Obviously, we've missed a wall, and as I look at this again, I see, oh, if I was to imagine myself as Randall in Flat World, this vertex here would be a silhouette, as well as this vertex being a silhouette. And so we simply draw, snapping to grid is very helpful, we simply draw a wall from point to point. Now, one consideration is, or one major difference is the fact that at no point can you see inside of this trace walled box, but you can see pretty much the entirety of this silhouette walled box once you've walked around and revealed some of the fog of war. This is one of the aesthetic drawbacks. In most cases, the null terrain inside of this box does not matter one way or another to gameplay. But in some cases, it could. For instance, if there was a hidden door somewhere along the edge of this object that revealed something interesting on the inside, this simple technique would not work. But because there's no traversable ground in here, it feels perfectly appropriate to just let the players see a little bit more of the terrain. On a personal note, revealing more of this null terrain can help the feeling of claustrophobia or disorientation if you are meandering through very tight and highly obscured areas as a player, which I'll have some more examples about in a moment. So this is the basic idea. We want to find the silhouette vertices, and then we want to make sure that you cannot see through the object. And this is most easily done by just crossing your walls here. So at no point in time can I see back here from here. Easy peasy. Let's move on to something a little bit more complicated. Many structures that we adventure through in our games are made at right angles and are square, rectangular, very simple, low complexity shapes. And traditional walling for this case would look something like this. We have an outside border that defines our play area. We have come in through some ingress route, and we are looking around for threats. And I'm sure we can all imagine what this will look like as you step through. All of a sudden, you can start seeing these goblins as you move through. So this is where one of the advantages of the silhouette walling really comes into play. These two examples, left and right, have the exact same effective visibility, but the silhouette walling on the right uses 6 fewer walls. This is the big key. Even for a simple room structure like this, we are already seeing a pretty good reduction in the number of walls. Now, to be fair, there's very little concern of the number of walls until you start approaching the many hundreds. But we like to be considerate for any amount of hardware. from the weakest potato to the strongest gaming machine, and these considerations help with that. So to provide a side-by-side example, as these two Randalls step into this goblin-infested room. Let me reset the Fog of War and select my Randalls. So, paying attention to the blue area, which is the playable space. The gray area in this case is what I've referred to as null terrain. It doesn't matter. You can't traverse it. There could be some cool artwork there, but it's not that big of a deal. We can see that this initial line of sight is 100%, if I can avoid misclicking, is 100% identical. Now, as these Randalls begin to step through and begin to explore this space, we also see the new goblins at the exact same places with the exact same amount of space revealed. This little goblin hanging out in the corner is still hidden because of our walls. Randall keeps moving in, takes out a few goblins, chop chop, it begins his egress. Aha, there's one more. So, apart from the null terrain that we've exposed on the right-hand side with the silhouette walling, every line of sight calculation through this room has been effectively identical. We don't see tokens that we shouldn't see, and we see the tokens that we logically should be able to see. All is well. So, looking back on the walling layer, again, you pretend that you are Randall, and you are sitting in the middle of this room, and you're looking out around. And what you're looking for are these silhouette edges. And these silhouette edges are easily identified because they are almost always, in every single case, formed with a reflex angle. That is an angle that is more than 180 degrees. I.e., every single one of these corners that I have marked with wall vertices. There are no wall vertices on these acute angles here because they provide no silhouette in order to occlude anything. If you can see this wall from any point, you can see the entirety of this wall because there is nothing blocking it. But if you can see this wall, it does not necessarily mean you can see this wall around the corner, which is what this wall vertex represents. Now, there is a little bit of judgment involved with drawing the other anchor point. But usually, I simply, as shown here, just draw it back to the nearest skeleton wall. Just tie it to something so that these two quadrants, or these two sections you've created, are physically distinct. So that when Randall steps in and is in this small corridor, he does not see through into the larger room on either side. As he steps in and is now on the other side of that wall, the reverse happens. We can see this null terrain, but we can't see anything of the traversable terrain that we shouldn't be able to see. And this walling pattern is something that that I use constantly. Finding a vertex of a reflex wall and just starting to draw the terrain there. And we can see how quick it is. I mean, it's all of 4 walls that I'm drawing here. And it's a matter of finding, okay, that wall bends back. Let me put a point here. Now, where can I bind it? It really doesn't matter. It could be anywhere from here to here, and the net effect would be the same. So for sake of argument, let's put it out here. We do the same thing for the other corners, and just to mix it up a little bit, I'll move their anchor points around. Here, here, and here. And yet again, when Randall walks around, the vision is still 100% accurate for the areas of interest. Now, That's a pretty simple example. And really, if you were to trace wall these simple rooms, you would not see any impact whatsoever. It's when we start expanding into more complex shapes. Caves, in particular, are difficult to trace wall. So on the left, again, I've shown an example of trace walling. And of course, you can have more detail or less detail with this trace walling as you prefer, but I've been rather tight with the number of vertices that I attempted to place. And if we walk Randall through this, we see that it looks exactly as we expect. The center column is occluding a lot of stuff, and as we walk around, you can't see the goblins. This little bend in the corner blocks light until we walk around it. All's well. Now, before I really look at the walls on the other side, let's take a side-by-side walk through this cave system, where the left-hand side has been trace walled and the right-hand side has been silhouette walled. Start reset the fog of war again, of course. Without moving, let's take a close look. Let's see. I see, the top edge of this column exactly shown here. That is about the same amount of wall. I see a tiny little bit of wall in the distance, and I can see a little bit of the fact that there's a corner beginning to form here on both sides. As Randall steps into and through the room, we're keeping our eye on these silhouette edges that are about to reveal a lot of terrain on both sides. All of a sudden, once we've taken another 2 steps, we can see, oh, there's 2 goblins here. And you can actually see a little bit of error that I've introduced here, as in the silhouette wall appears to be a little bit more conservative, a little bit more aggressive with its culling than the traced walled. But that is, I'm going to attribute that to human error because I did not get the vertices exactly aligned between these 2 maps. But again, 95% is about right. It's about 95% correct. And as we step around, we see that the goblins reveal at the same times. The shadows move in the same times. And here's a really good example of deciding how much detail you want with these silhouette walls. As far as a circle or a spherical object is concerned, no matter where you look from it, the silhouette is still going to be a circle because it's all rounded and effectively all angles of these walls are reflex. They continue to bend away from each other. So as we take a closer look at this, we can see where the error is mainly occurring. This little point of the circle juts out a little bit and has been traced on the trace wall example, whereas I did not place a wall vertex here. Personally, I wouldn't mind that too much. Seeing a goblin 1 square before I should isn't going to be the end of the world, but it is easily fixed by simply adding another vertex. Let me turn off grid snapping. Simply adding another vertex and making sure it intersects with another wall. Doesn't matter exactly how it looks, but now when we look at these 2 Randalls, we see that their vision has been restored. And so now we are almost exactly correct and identical. And as we continue to leave this cave, we think all is well until we step around a corner and see this goblin. So, there's a few feet of error here and there. And effectively, the more wall vertices you add, the more the silhouette version will begin to approach the traced version. And the point of this video is not to say that silhouette walling is always better than trace walling. It's simply to give you another tool in your belt. I personally hate having to trace wall these caverns because it just takes so long. If we look at the silhouette version of these caverns, we see the exact same idea as our simple blue room example. All I'm doing is noting where the walls begin to bend away, where there's a reflex corner that could potentially hide or reveal something behind it. So if we zoom in really close, particularly on this pitchfork pattern, which I end up using a lot, particularly for these soft arcs that happen in caves a lot, I place 3 to 4 vertices around the wall as it begins to bend away, and just intersect them back here somewhere so that so that we don't have any light leaks. We can see a simpler example here where I did not think that a wall vertex along this area would be necessary. So instead, I simply placed 2 wall vertices here, just to kind of give a little bit more of a round entry, which I will demonstrate again. So we can, as we walk around this edge, this second vertex here doesn't do a lot, but it does kind of show that this is a more rounded edge. And really, this wall vertex isn't necessary. It would still be nearly 100% correct if that wall vertex wasn't there. It really doesn't provide much. But I had the wall placed, so why not extend it and help improve the aesthetics a little bit. So this pitchfork pattern is something that I end up using a lot in all of these rounded corners. We're going to see a more extreme example in just a moment. But I do want to draw attention to objects that you can navigate around, this central column. Effectively, you are going to wall it the same way as any other convex object. You're looking for the silhouette edges that you think are most important, because with the circle, there are infinite numbers. So pick a few. In this case, I've picked 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 edges that I'm going to call silhouettes, and I've drawn walls to reflect that. Moving on to our next example, the cavernous tunnel. This is where I think the silhouette walling really helps out play and helps out disorientation from the players, because moving through a very tightly walled cavern can feel uncomfortable, both physically as the character itself, as you continue to bump up against walls and can't quite scoot around them the way that you would expect. It also, you lose a lot of context of where you are and what you're doing. In some cases, that's exactly what you want, but I found in most cases, having some context of the rest of the map kind of helps immerse you a little bit more. And I see arguments for either way. So as we walk through this tunnel, this feels pretty traditional. The walls are tight. They get a little bit awkward as you try and move through these corners, and then we can leave. In contrast, the silhouette walling, let me reset the fog just so we have a better idea. This walling looks weird right off the bat, but you'll notice that the effective vision is still going to work. We have null terrain on this upper side and this lower side that can reveal more of the art of the map, give a little, a reminder that we're in a dank, damp cavern, or a very arid carved desert pathway. That's not the right word. But as Randall steps through the fuzzy walled version, or the silhouette walled version, we see the important bits are still there. This corner still hides all of this area around it, and this corner also hides everything behind it. As Randall steps through, we begin to see and reveal more of the tunnel, as well as the null terrain surrounding it. But importantly, around this corner again, our vision is blocked, and if there was a threat hiding here, we could not see it. Just to kind of give a side-by-side of what this would look like. I have these our two Randalls start in the exact same cavern walled two different ways. And we'll just see how their vision compares, see where I've made mistakes. So far, this line looks 100% identical, and there is no other hidden wall that the traced walled technique can see that the silhouette walled version does not, and vice versa. 100% identical as far as I'm concerned. We get to this corner, and between here, we see that the shape, this little tiny, teeny tiny sight line, is almost 100% the same between these two versions. As we step forward, now all of a sudden we can see the whole arc of the tunnel, which again has no wall vertices because this arc does not occlude anything. It does not bend away or create a reflex angle or silhouette. So we continue walking around these two squares. We can see all the way down the tunnel from here. Very simple to imagine, all the way down. And at the very end of the tunnel, we cannot see around the corner. Now it looks like the silhouette walled version has a vertex that's a little bit pulled back from the trace walled version, but really we see, what's that, like a quarter more of a square. Big deal. We continue stepping through, and just as expected, as we begin to round the corner, we see a very similar sight line beginning to evolve right here. And then by this point, we can see the entire egress of the room. The walling here makes heavy use of this pitchfork pattern that I used before. So we can see that these soft arcs, these soft curves in the tunnel, I have created multiple three-prong pitchforks, for lack of a better word, to create kind of a softer transition around. Really, you could probably get away with not having any of these forks. This one, this one, this one, and this one. And the lighting would be still very close, but not as accurate. Because here we do see the wall kind of bending away, and this would be a silhouette vertex. Now, if you take that to the extreme, of course, every single point along here would be a silhouette vertex. And you can, this is a really good example to show that as you increase your number of silhouettes on the silhouette walling technique, it begins to approach the exact same shape as the trace walled. But in this case, done a little bit more inefficiently because the walls are longer and I have placed more vertices. So in fact, I bet this version would actually look very smooth as you walked around it. Indeed. This is simply a personal choice. Some areas of the map warrant more detail with your line of sight. Most areas of your map do not warrant that amount of detail. So you can use these techniques as you see fit. Let's see. Now, we've kind of shown 4 common structures, and I have generated a random cave map to kind of show this in action. And to be fair, this cave map is purposefully very jaggy and would be an absolute nightmare to trace wall. Even traditional walling would have a bit of a hard time with this, just due to the number of crevices and nooks and crannies and extrusions and all these tiny little randomly generated goodness. Before I show the walls, I'm actually just going to walk through with Randall. Starting at the entrance of this cavern, which I imagine there's some territory war between goblins and kobolds, and we're just getting in the middle of it. We step into the cave, and we see the line of sight beginning to pull back as we enter this larger cavern. We can see a goblin revealed up here to the top, and our line of sight is limited down here. If we were to keep moving, here are the goblins on the other side. As we continue walking around, we see that there's a wall here that we're going to, it looks like a little skirmish between a goblin and a kobold is going on. We're gonna just waltz right past that, no problem. We start to see these walls here, and as we step around, we can see the two kobolds cowering for their life, and the matriarch down here at the bottom in this tight, difficult to move through passageway. Now, I have done a couple things purposely here to make it look as close to trace walling as possible, and that is I am using a black background for the null terrain, and I have my vision settings set to dim light radius, bright light radius, with a color value of 0. This lights up the area but does not add any color to it. So the dark areas still look dark apart from the revealed grid, which you could easily turn off and hide. But it feels pretty good to walk through here. Doesn't look like there are any real line of sight errors. You can notice one oddity right here and right here. It looks like the walls that I've drawn jut out from the map, and this is entirely a personal choice, but generally when I'm walling cavern maps, I stick all of my wall vertices on the grid intersections. It helps with the players moving around so their tokens don't get hung up on small pieces of walls that jut into their square. So you can see here I have reduced the amount of line of sight that Randall should have, because he should be able to see a little bit more through this area if we were looking at just this wall here. But the closest grid vertex I had was here, so that's where I placed it. You could pull this wall vertex back and have it only partially intersecting this grid, and that would be perfectly fine in 99% of cases. But I find snapping walls to grid vertices to be a very quick and easy way to slap down a bunch of walls and get you most of the way there. So now let's take a look at the walls that I have used, and you're going to see a lot of these patterns coming back into play. You can see my pitchfork pattern that I've used on this long, not quite smooth, but very long arc of a cavern wall. Identically, we see a pitchfork down here and a very long, but still a pitchfork-esque structure down here. Now, one thing to keep in mind, as we can kind of note from this large null terrain area, let me get Randall over there, you can see all the way into this area. And to be fair, seeing all of this map does tell me that there are no secret areas in this map unless the GM has done some very, very clever tricks with tiles and hiding and things like that. This does kind of tell me there's nothing down here. Whether that's a good or bad thing is totally up to your group, your DM, and your personal preferences. Personally, I don't mind it if it gives the players a little bit more information about the labyrinth of caverns that they're traversing, then so be it. I think that's for the best. But it's to eliminate this null area is simply a matter of just adding another wall along the grid lines. And when we look back at Randall and reset his fog, maybe. That's a goblin. Randall, if we select Randall, then we can see that his vision has been restricted a little bit more tightly around this narrow corridor, meaning that anything could be down here. And it doesn't really change anything. We're working with, at the moment, 37 walls for this whole cavern. Even another 100 walls wouldn't hurt us. So this is just fighting for the absolute minimum. Another common structure that happens in these caverns is kind of what I refer to as the skeleton walls, is that we do have to separate this area from this area somehow. And my silhouette vertices are not going to do it in and of themselves. So you can see this kind of backbone that I draw along the meat of this null terrain that kind of juts out. And I connect my actual wall vertices just to make sure they intersect through this skeleton backbone. We kind of see that coming into play here. I created a backbone to separate this area from this area when Randall is sitting right here. Then I added a pitchfork and effectively another pitchfork to create this rounded line of sight reveal. A lot of my cavernous tunnels end up looking basically like this. We have a skeleton wall on each side, and I just am drawing horizontal walls connecting straight across. This isn't a great example because I don't have varying indentations of these walls, but you could very easily imagine finding something that pokes out, drawing a wall so it intersects. Finding something that pokes out, drawing a wall. Finding something that pokes out, drawing a wall back to the skeleton backbone. And we've added 3 or 4 walls, and that would kind of increase the accuracy of this walling method, but by just a marginal amount. The last thing that I want to show is the effect of this null terrain, the revealing of this null terrain. So if we change Randall's token to have kind of a night vision view to its light, reset the fog, then this will really highlight the null terrain that we do see as we step around it. So you can see this area is just fully revealed, but there's nothing interesting there. And I'll just slowly walk through this map, and you can very plainly see the aesthetic drawbacks of this technique and how much of this null terrain you can bear is, again, personal preference. But I just wanted to show exactly what that looks like with high contrast. To me, this looks totally fine, and I would play on this map any day of the week. And it took me all of a minute to wall, 36 walls. As we step down, we see that this area is very tight as we've added a few more walls, and you don't see much of the null terrain until you start getting into these gaps. And we're down at the matriarch. We say everything's going to be okay, and we go take care of the goblin threat, and we're the heroes of the day. So I want to bring it back just to this page to kind of wrap things up. As we've seen with trace walling, they match the walls exactly. They give you very smooth line of sight reveals, but it can take a lot of walls to achieve that. With silhouette walling, it looks drastically different, not as smooth, very jaggy, but the performance is severely increased just by the reduction in the number of walls. And the accuracy, going to be absolutely fair, isn't 100%, but it's very, very close. So I moved it down away from the accuracy just a little bit, to be fair. One last look at the wall counts before we move on. I believe this simple cavern is really where the strength of this technique is shown. So we have 67 walls on one side, which is not doesn't have a lot of detail tracing. I could have fit these to the walls tighter. I could have made this circle much more well-defined, but this felt right. In comparison, effectively the same line of sight calculations, but only using 17 or 18 walls with this additional one that I added live. So we have cut the number of walls by more than half with no effective line of sight change. And that's really the point that I want to drive home. If you are walling to use cover, if you're walling to have, reveal moments, you don't need to trace the walls. You simply need to find the important bits of the walls. And as Randall sits here in Flat World and looks at these two three-dimensional objects in his limited 2D concept of the world, I hope this image kind of sticks with you a little bit. Because now, whenever I'm walling maps, I am simply imagining myself as Randall stepping through these areas and thinking about these edges of the caves, these edges of statues that would occlude or reveal objects behind them. That's all I have on the topic for today. There's much, much more we could go into about the idea of visibility and computing visibility and how that play and the considerations for doing so and what they look like in your game. But I wanted to leave this relatively short for the time being. And I hope you all learned something. I hope it helps you in your games. I hope you use this tool when you need it, and don't use it when you don't. It does not hurt my feelings, but yeah, happy gaming, everybody. Happy walling, and take that wall prep time, cut it in half easily by just applying a few of these techniques to your next cavern map. Thank you. Bye-bye.